Me karakia tātou. Ha ki roto, breathe in. Ha ki waho, breathe out. Kia tau te mauri I kōkiri nei. Settle the mauri that stirs inside of me. Ko te rangi Māori e taku I rapu nei. It is peace that I seek. Ti hei mauri ora. Over to you, Andrea.
Thanks, Robbie. Tēnā koutou katoa, and a warm welcome to everybody joining the webinar today with Dr. Brigit Mirfin-Veitch, Director of the Donald Beasley Institute, and her colleagues Umi and Robbie. This is a collaboration between Te Pou, the Donald Beasley Institute, Fragile X New Zealand, and Good Lies Wairarapa. My name's Andrea Lee. I'm the Executive Director for Fragile X New Zealand and the parent of a learning disabled young adult son. The seed of the idea for this webinar came from Anita Nichols, hearing Brigit speak at a conference. As a professional working in the disability sector, but also as a parent of two intellectually disabled adults, it struck Anita how important the information she was hearing was, and how most of us as parents, whānau, and or disabled people don't easily get access to it. So that was the driver for our action in bringing this webinar to life. Huge thanks to Brigit for agreeing to come on board and for Te Pou for their support. The information you will hear comes out of learnings from the Royal Commission of Inquiry and research with people with a learning disability. So to let you know, a recording of the presentation will be available online after the webinar. We plan to have it available in as many places as possible to increase the chance it makes it to the people and places it's needed. Again, thank you to Brigit and her colleagues for your generosity in allowing this to happen. Thanks also to those who've agreed to host the recording on the websites. A list of those organisations will be in the chat, and you will also be emailed a PDF copy of the slides. So you'll note there's an opportunity for question and answer at the end of the presentation. With the high number of registrations, we've had around 150, we are aware we may not get to answer all questions, but we will do our best to respond to as many as possible within the scheduled timeframe. Just to let you know that very specific or detailed questions will be difficult to respond to in the time we have, and responses will be generalised. The Q&A will not be recorded. So you can write a question in the Q&A webinar function during the presentation, or use the chat function if you can't find the Q&A function on your device. If for accessibility reasons you need your microphone unmuted, please message a request to the Te Pou admin. Because of the size of the webinar, you'll notice cameras have been turned off. So I'm now going to hand over to Brigit to introduce herself and her team.
Nā mihi kia koe, Andrea. Ko te mihi tuatahi ki te atua, ko ia te timatanga me te whakamutanga o ngā mea katoa. I tika ana ki te mihi atu ki ngā mate, ki a rātou mā kua riro atu ki te wāhi ngāro, nō reira e te hunga wairua, haere, haere, haere atu rā. Nō reira ki a tātou i te kanohi ora, mauri ora ki a tātou katoa. Tēnā koutou e hoa mā. Kua hui mai nei ki tēnei hui ki te pupuri I te kaupapa o te rā. Nō reira, ka nui te hari ki a koutou, mō tō koutou manawa nui ki te hāpai I ngā kaupapa, I pā ana ki te tēnei wahi. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko wai au. I tipu aki au ki kirikiri roa ki te tāwharau o Parongia. Ko Waikato te awanana a hau I whāngai, e noho ana au ki Tāmaki Makaurau. Ko Robbie Francis Watene tōku ingoa. He kairaka hau mātua whaikaha a hau ki Donald Beasley Institute. Robbie's my name. I grew up in Hamilton under the shelter of the Parongia Mountain, and Waikato was the river that nourished me. And I now live in South Auckland, and I'm disabled research lead at the Donald Beasley Institute. So what I've shared just now on behalf of the Donald Beasley Institute, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you all here to this webinar. I acknowledge the creator, the beginning and the end. Also acknowledge those who have passed, and we keep them in our minds as we in today's discussion. Also the living who are here with us today. We thank you all for taking time out of, I'm sure, very, very busy days at this busy time of year to share this time and space with us as we learn and we grow together. And so I'm now going to ask my colleagues to introduce themselves. Thank you, Umi.
Kia ora, Robbie. Kia ora koutou katoa, he uri aho no hapani, he tangata te tiriti aho, he kairaka ho me whakaraka ho a koraka no Donald Beasley Institute, ko Umi Asaka toku ikua. My name is Umi Asaka, and I'm a researcher and educator at the Donald Beasley Institute, and I'm also a proud second-generation disabled person. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'll hand over to you, Brigit.
Thanks, Umi. Tēnā koutou katoa, I tipu aki ahau, I raro, I te tāwharo, o ka pai moka o paparoa, I taha o te awa o Otatutu, kei Otipoti toku kaiaka anaianei, hei kairuki mātua hau no Donald Beasley Institute ko Brigit Mirfin-Veitch, toku ikua. My name is Brigit Mirfin-Veitch, and I just shared that I grew up on the beautiful West Coast under the Paparoa mountain range and alongside the Rough River. I now live in Dunedin, and I'm very lucky to be the director of the Donald Beasley Institute, and it gives me great pleasure also to welcome you to this webinar, which we have titled Ka Mua, Ka Muri, Walking Backwards into the Future, Learning from the Royal Commission of Inquiry and Research with People with a Learning Disability. As the title suggests, we believe the experience shared by people with a learning disability tells us a lot about how to recognise and how to challenge and ultimately to eliminate violence in the lives of people with a learning disability. The research project we are speaking about today is called Tell Me About You, which is a project that contributed directly into the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse and Care. And the purpose and the nature of the research means that we can't talk about this project, Tell Me About You, without talking about abuse. So we just wanted to say, please take care of yourself as you listen to our presentation. Take breaks if you need to, step out if you need to. Before we go any further, we'd just like to share a little bit about the Donald Beasley Institute, our organisation. We're a national independent research institute, and we're focused on inclusive and disability-led research and education. And on the screen is our team photo, including our toa, our organisation's grandmother, Hine Forsyth. And of our team of 11 of us identify as disabled, and 2 are the whānau of disabled people. We'd just also like to acknowledge, as is our way, our mātāpono, or our values. And every mātāpono is connected, and everything we do at the DBI is guided by these 5 values, and they make us who we are as an organisation. And they are, just quickly, whakatinana, honour te tiriti o Waitangi, whakarakatira, respectful, whakawhanaunataka, relational, whakamana, ethical, whakawhiranaki, accountable, and whakakotahi, inclusive. And last but not least is family. And we're very committed to the value of whānau first, which is really relevant to our discussions today. So how did we come to be involved in the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse and Care? Just quickly, as many of you know, the inquiry officially began in 2019, and it had 3 main aims: to investigate abuse and care that occurred between 1950 and 1999, to acknowledge people who had experienced abuse, and to make sure that abuse does not happen again. And so in 2021, when the inquiry was in full swing, we were asked to design an inclusive and accessible research project for people with a learning disability, neurodivergent people, and other disabled people who had experienced state care. And even though there have been great efforts made to be really inclusive, the formal inquiry pathways did remain unknown and in some ways inaccessible for some people. And for others, they didn't enable them to tell their stories in a way that they wanted to. So in response, we developed an alternative research-based approach to complement the other pathways into the Royal Commission. So we could make sure that people that we knew were frequently subjected to abuse and state care could have their stories make their way into the inquiry. And so we called the project Tell Me About You. Over to you, Umi.
Sorry, just getting the mic and camera on. So we'd like to tell you a little bit about how we did the project called Tell Me About You and what framed and guided the project. So the project was guided by a 4 foundational pole. First was Te Tiriti o Waitangi, which is also a foundation that underpin all of our research project at the Donald Beasley Institute. Te Tiriti o Waitangi was given practical expression through Maori governance group of the project and Kaupapa Maori research methodology and tikanga. Second core value was the assumption that everyone has the right to participate in research. For people who wanted to tell their stories but found it difficult to express their will and preference about the research, we used supported decision-making strategies to confirm their consent and to take part in their ongoing involvement. Third, the research team used individually responsive method, also known as IRM, to make sure storytellers had choice and control over how they told their stories. The kaupapa of this project was that storytellers were the experts when it came to representing their own care experiences, including abusive experiences. The Donald Beasley Institute developed IRM as a way of including the voices of disabled people whose experiences can be difficult to access using more traditional research method. IRM lets people design and control their participation in research by working with a story gatherer, also known as researcher, to tell their story in a way that is personally meaningful and accessible, while being responsive to the life experiences, interests, and needs, and diverse communication styles of each storytellers. While we don't have time to go into too much details about the way people told their stories, we would like to share some of the methods that they chose to tell their stories. So the first one was kaupapa Maori method, including Purako. Another was semi-structured interviews, walking, wheeling, and talking, sharing stories by taking their writing partner or the researchers to the places that was important to them and telling them why. Telling stories through personal archives, art or poetry, or emails or other online technologies, and telling stories with the help of trusted whānau, friends, or close supporters, or have them tell their stories as they knew it for them. And every single ways of telling these stories were used within our project. First and most critically, the project was underpinned by a trauma-informed approach, which is based on understanding that trauma can affect individuals' thoughts and actions. You will have already noticed us using the term storyteller instead of survivor. The trauma-informed approach was one of the pole or the foundation that guided us to invite people who had experienced care to take part as storytellers rather than survivors. While we respect and use the term survivor, we use the word storyteller so the person could control their narrative and apply their own label to the care experiences. It came as no surprise to most of you here today that the word abuse and survivor while not often the term that storytellers with a learning disability apply to themselves at any stage of the research, even though all of us here today would use a term to describe their care experiences. So I just went ahead of myself a little bit just now, but I would like to share with you the focus of the project, which also aligned with the terms of reference of the Royal Commission of Inquiry. So the question that was asked within the project was, first, what types of abuse did people experience in care? Second, what were the factors that contributed to the abuse they experienced? Third, what impact did the abuse have on the storytellers and their families, friends, supporters, and community? And lastly, but not the least, did the storytellers understand why they were taken into care? And did they think those places were appropriate? So I'll hand over to Robbie to take us through the next part.
Thank you, Umi. So we answered these questions by exploring one main question, but from different angles. And that question was, what was your experience of care? Now, asking this broad question was aligned with that trauma-informed approach that Umi just mentioned, which asks, what happened to you rather than what's wrong with you? And when working with a group of people who had experienced a lifetime of being perceived as bad or deficit in some way, we needed to take a trauma-informed approach. And this also meant that storytellers could talk about both the good and the bad experiences in care. And this was quite important to storytellers who sometimes wanted to acknowledge positive care experiences and maybe relationships that they had. So who were our storytellers? Well, over about 15 months, we worked with 16 storytellers, including 12 men and 4 women, all aged between 45 and 75 years of age. They were ethnically diverse. 10 had a learning disability, 3 identified as autistic, and 1 storyteller had a neurological disability. We had ethics approval for storytellers to either use their own names or they could use a pseudonym. This meant that we had to work really carefully with each individual to make sure that they fully understood and had thought about the long-term impacts of being identified as, for example, a survivor of abuse in care for potentially the rest of their life. And as a result of this process, actually almost every storyteller chose to use their own name. Now, in the Tell Me About You report, the stories are presented in full, and this is our way of honouring each storyteller's journey into, through, and beyond care, acknowledging that most of the storytellers still remain dependent on the disability or health system in some way. And to us at the DBI, these 14 stories are the heart of this project. They are precious, precious taonga. And we urge you all to read or listen to the stories, which can be found on our website, and we'll provide a link a little bit later. But I also wanted to note they are confronting and at times pretty distressing. They provide intimate details of the full spectrum of abuse that storytellers had experienced, from cultural, spiritual, financial, physical, sexual, psychological, medical, educational abuse, and violence. And they happened in childhood and in adulthood, right across that lifespan. Now today, though, we're going to focus on the very broad systemic findings. We've decided to do this because this is what has the potential to help us better recognise violence and abuse and to collectively commit to those actions that will help to prevent it from happening in the future. Now, a key focus of the research was to understand more about the physical, the cultural, and the emotional landscapes where abuse was able to occur. And the individual stories provided us with an overarching view of these landscapes. But we also drew on what is known as the ecological model of disability, violence, and abuse to collectively analyse these stories. The ecological model is a framework for exploring and understanding the relationship between factors that both impact on disabled people, as well as creating environments where violence and abuse can occur, making a good fit with the questions the Royal Commission of Inquiry sought to answer and to assist us so that systemic abuse never happens again. The ecological model explores these factors, as you see in the picture here, at an individual, a relational, a community, and societal levels, and was important in the context of the Royal Commission, as it provided a way to challenge the notion that abuse against disabled people was simply a few bad things being done by a few bad people. No. The ecological model also enabled us to move beyond abuse and violence events to understanding more about the factors that enabled it to occur. It helped us show that the abuse and violence experienced by people with a learning disability was systematic, that it did not occur because disabled people are inherently vulnerable, and we're going to come back to this point later because it's an important one. Brigit, I'm going to ask you to take us through the different levels from individual level. Thank you.
Thanks, Robbie. So when we looked at the individual level, using this model to help us make sense, I guess, of the stories, the experiences that people had told us about, almost without exception, storytellers described a lack of agency, or in the language that we might understand better, a lack of choice and control over their lives. The people that helped us in our research told us repeatedly about repeated restrictions and assaults on their individuality and their ability to have choice and control in their lives, often by highlighting what was important to their sense of well-being now. So they highlighted what had been missing. The experiences that storytellers with a learning disability highlighted to us was a lack of rights, lack of will and preference, that people didn't know about their rights and they did not see themselves as having rights. But really importantly, they were also not recognised as rights holders by other people, and they were always assumed to lack the ability or the capacity to express their will and preferences, or their opinions, in other words. Another way of saying this, and this is a way that we've used quite a lot, is that people with a learning disability experienced a lack of recognition of relational personhood. And in our project, and Tell Me About You, we came up with a definition of personhood as being respect for an individual's essence of being, their freedom to make choices and have autonomy, their freedom to love and be loved, to belong to and to relate to others. The personhood of storytellers who took part in Tell Me About You was constantly challenged. It was challenged by medical practitioners, by carers, and by staff and other managers and other people in the care settings that they lived in. It was common for them to experience cultural alienation, or a loss of being able to engage with their culture, and a loss of their personal identity. None of the storytellers with a non-European cultural background had access to their culture or their cultural practices, and that general loss of individual identity was central to all stories. And I think many of us here today have listened to the words of the late, great Sir Robert Martin around that loss of individual identity. Feeling lost and invisible is a really personal feeling, and those dehumanizing experiences, though, are created and they're reinforced and they're maintained by things like colonization and racism and ableism and disableism. And all of those oppressions are related, and they appeared at every level within the ecological model. When we looked to the relational level of the model, we're asked to think about power and control in the relationships that disabled people have with family, whānau, with peers, with intimate partners, co-workers and others in their day-to-day lives, including within their relationships with paid carers, with educators, health and allied health professionals and workers in disability service systems, past and present and future, actually. The storytellers in Tell Me About You describe relationships that were characterised by others holding power over them. There's no other way to explain it. They experienced direct and repeated physical, emotional, psychological abuse and neglect, particularly in the forms of forced seclusion and a high rate of sexual violence. And that violence and seclusion and abuse was perpetrated by people who were paid to care for them. We're all aware of this, unfortunately. Without exception, efforts to report abuse were diminished, not treated seriously, or led to retribution or retaliation. For many of the storytellers, these experiences were connected to someone making decisions about them or for them, a really central theme or message that came through from storytellers. It was really clear that these substitute decision makers in people's lives didn't have a meaningful relationship with the people they were making decisions about. Storytellers with a learning disability went unconsulted and pretty voiceless in the decisions that directly affected them. And this was particularly obvious in the management of family and whānau interactions and relationships. And so what we saw, and what people told us, was that they had a lack of opportunity to form and manage equal and respectful social relationships with family and with peers and with other people in their lives while they were in care. And so that was a really strong feature of the relational level. And for some people, some of the storytellers with a learning disability, they had been actively prevented from maintaining a relationship with their families. And sometimes that lack of, or that loss of connection with their whānau was irreversible. Umi, I'll now hand over to you to take us through the next couple of levels.
Thanks, Brigit. So, ecological model also challenges us to think about how disabled people are positioned within their communities, including how these perceptions impact and shape how disabled people experience their care and relationships. And when we say community, we mean their local community as well as how our perceptions are shaped. And so this level of model make it clear that community attitudes towards disabled people impact their experiences and extent to which they experience the benefit or the risks of associated being inside or outside of community. When we analyze the story using the community level lens, we identify a critical lack of access to housing, employment, and education. And unfortunately, we know that some of this is still true to this day. The stories shared in Tell Me About You illustrated the fundamental erosion of the rights to make decisions about where to live and make a home. Some storytellers described how they entered care due to a lack of support for their family carers, while others didn't know why they were entered into care. And one storyteller who shared their brother's stories said that they were placed in care because they could not participate in education. And no one chose to live in care, or nor could they access housing in the community. In fact, one storyteller with a learning disability had never genuinely chosen where they wanted to live and who they wanted to live with. And storytellers were also understood as non- or unproductive members of community members. This was clearly reflected in the work experience they did when their work was unpaid or underpaid. Being labeled or perceived as non-productive meant that their place and rights within the community was continuously under threat, and storytellers were universally understood as recipients of services and supports, and in substitute or reliant on the state. A lack of the right to individual agency or choice and control was reinforced at the community level. Relatedly, many storytellers were fundamentally and permanently assigned the role of recipients of services and supports through the initial act of being placed in care. And once in support, most storytellers remained as a recipient of services or supports even after the deinstitutionalization. And only a small number of storytellers have been able to completely break free and live life free of residential support. None were people who had learning disabilities. And when we say support and services, we mean by support and services who are organized by other authority rather than in partnership with their family or themselves. And the stories indicated that storytellers were perceived as non-citizens. They were deprived of genuine citizenship by being placed in institution and prevented from leaving, and had limited access to life experiences, education, and training that could support their ambition to determine their own futures. Due to their containment, storytellers were also excluded from being authentic members of their communities, including the sense of belonging typically associated being part of a community. And finally, we look to the systemic and societal level of ecological model and understanding how social structures impact and shape disability abuse and violence requires recognition that way society works is structured and framed by privilege and power embedded in economic, political, and social policies and practice that focuses on the dominant and most productive, in a quotation mark, members of society. For disabled people, there is a history of exclusion from these systems and discrimination within them. When we analyze the societal level factors, we observed laws and policies that denied legal personhood rights. We know that policies relating to support for disabled people in the era of institutionalization were developed in response to a system that valued segregation and neglect. It was also clear that education, employment, and health models segregated and specialized. Storytellers described being separated from their families, taken away from homes to institutions that were special service. Often these separations were brutal, occurring against the will of the disabled people, and often in absence of their involvement in the decision-making process. Limited access to legal and societal protection. Disabled people in care had little effective control over how they were treated, or no clear pathway to justice, or to seek accountability for the violence and abuse they experienced. Storytellers were often outsiders in society. Support and treatment was provided outside or away from the mainstream society. Societal attitude of the time meant that when support or treatment was sought, the seeker was placed out of sight in institution at the geographic and or regional margin of their communities. So what does all of these analysis add up to? I'll hand over to Robbie to talk about that.
So using this ecological model of disability abuse and violence as a framework for analysing these stories clearly showed that disabled people in care between 1950 and 1999 were impacted by social and care systems that were underpinned by ableism and disableism. Now let me just break this down a little. So ableism refers to belief systems that value certain bodies and certain minds according to socially constructed ideas of what is normal and productive and desirable. And it's actually an umbrella term that has also been used to understand all of the other isms. On the screen there's sexism, classism, racism, and it all justifies placing one group's needs over another according to these socially defined characteristics. Now, disableism, on the other hand, is an oppression that directly targets and impacts disabled people. And it's a prejudice that considers disabled people's bodies and minds perhaps as deviant from the norm, so therefore in need of interventions to adapt to the order of society. Disableism acts as a byproduct of ableism. Disableism cannot exist without ableist assumptions and practices. So when we, disabled people, encounter disableism, we also encounter discrimination and oppression and behavior that is abusive because of the belief that disabled people are inferior to non-disabled people simply because of our disability status. And abuse of disabled people in care, including most of the storytellers that we spoke with, can be considered as blatant disableism. They were abused because they were part of an ableist system that created opportunities and environments where abuse could and did occur, and they were in that system because they were disabled. So it's important to note that ableism and disableism haven't always been an inherent part of society here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. There's been many scholars who have talked about this, but is highlighted in particular by Ingham and colleagues. Prior to colonisation, whānau hoa and takata whaikaha Māori, disabled Māori people and their families, existed as part of whānau or acknowledged as having particular gifts or contributions that added to the lives of the wider collective. The institutionalisation and segregation of whānau hoa and takata whaikaha Māori was and remains the enduring negative legacy of colonisation. And just to be totally crystal clear, the factors that we have identified at every single one of these levels of the ecological model are the factors that enabled abuse and violence to flourish in the past. There's no reason to think that these will not be the factors that will allow abuse and violence to flourish both now, in the present, and also in the future. And finally, these factors, they do not point to individual vulnerability. They point to systemic failures. Brigit.
Thanks, Robbie. So, what do the stories shared by survivors of past abuse that took part in the project that we're talking about today, Tell Me About You, tell us about the prevention and response to disability, violence and abuse in the future? So let's just briefly revisit the findings of the analysis of the ecological model that we've just talked through and ask ourselves a few very hard questions. Are the things that people with a learning disability and in some cases their whānau told us about their past really no longer a part of their present? We know that there are both parents and service providers online today, and we want to emphasise that the answers to these questions are relevant to both of you. So if we think about the individual level, hand on heart, can we as parents, carers or service providers really say that disabled people and people with a learning disability in particular are still not experiencing a lack of agency or choice and control, a lack of recognition of their relational and legal personhood, the right to have relationships of their choosing, a lack of recognition of their rights, will and preference, and in some cases, cultural alienation or a loss of identity. We think to the relational level, can we, hand on our heart, say that disabled people don't continue to experience relationships characterised by others holding power over them in their lives, others making decisions about their lives, including about their relationships, and a lack of opportunity to form and manage their own social relationships with families, peers, or with intimate partners? And if we ask ourselves the hard question, can we really say that disabled people are valued and equal community members who no longer experience a lack of access to housing, employment, education, or the sort of supports and services that they need to live a life of their choosing? And have we really got rid of attitudes that characterise disabled people, particularly people with a learning disability, as non-productive, as recipients of services and supports, as reliant on the state for funding and to access the supports they need, and as non-citizens? And finally, hand on heart, can we say that Aotearoa does not have laws and policies that deny personhood rights? Education, employment and health models that still segregate or specialise or simply don't meet people's needs, and limited access to legal and social protections for disabled people. So while we can, and I hope we will, all continue to think deeply about these questions, I know that many of you are probably wondering about or considering or thinking about right now broader government policies and decisions, especially the recent changes in the disability sector, and whether these will address the factors that we have that have been identified as leading to abuse, or whether they will further entrench those factors. And while it might feel like we can't do much to change political administrations or priorities or cycles, there are things that we can all commit to doing. So if we think to some of the solutions, first, let's commit to the tools that should be guiding us as disabled people, family, whānau, close supporters, allies, service providers, whoever we are. And they are Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the New Zealand Disability Strategy, and trauma-informed approaches to policy and principles such as enabling good lives. These fundamental and enduring documents, even though sometimes they might feel quite far away at the moment, remind us of the foundational or principles disabled people themselves identified as essential to their lives. They can also guide how we respond to the factors that can enable abuse to occur at all levels of that ecological model that we've just talked about. So if we think about the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, we continue to hold a really strong view that Article 12 of the UN CRPD, equal recognition before the law, must be fully implemented to ensure that the personhood of disabled people, especially people with cognitive impairments, is recognised and respected, including the right for all disabled people to be responded to as citizens with legal and mental capacity. However, regardless of the outcomes of reviews like the Adult Capacity Law Review that's currently happening here in Aotearoa, we can all commit to the intention of Article 12. Article 12 is about recognising that disabled people, including people with a learning disability and other cognitive impairments, have the right to make their own choices and decisions, and the assistance to help them make those self-chosen, informed decisions. So as parents and carers of young children, one of the most critical things you can do is start to assist your loved whānau to build the skills and knowledge early. And for those of you with older children and adults, commit to this now. The research is telling us that working with people to build that capacity in decision making, to build that knowledge that they are rights holders and can make their own choices is the change can occur quickly and it's really impactful. I know also that it's hard for some people, including myself, to try and move beyond thinking about what you or others think about what someone else's best interest is, but teach people from the earliest possible opportunity to know their rights and to express their opinions. Other people, professionals, organisations and systems working in ways that were supposedly in disabled people's best interests led to the level of abuse in care the Royal Commission of Inquiry has so starkly evidenced over the past several years, and certainly acknowledged the apology last week. Knowing your children's human rights as well as their will and preferences, however they make those known, is critical. And for those of you here today who have loved ones who find it difficult to express themselves in a way other people understand, please embrace your role as their most trusted communication assistant, the person that knows them best. If the Royal Commission has told us anything, it is that disabled children and adults were not listened to or believed over many decades, a situation created by the ableism and disableism Robbie spoke about earlier. We can change this right now. We also urge you to be vigilant to small and large abuses. Some of you may have attended Professor Sally Robinson's presentation last week at the University of Otago Critical Disability Studies Network. Sally talked about everyday harm, so-called minor assaults on a person's sense of identity and self-worth. Things like teasing, joking, staring, excluding, not being asked for an opinion. These everyday harms are evidence of a clear lack of respect for people with a learning disability. And the storytellers and Tell Me About You describe those everyday harms in detail and at length. And the accumulation of those over a lifetime appeared to have more of a lasting impact on people than some of the more overt abuse and violence they described alongside these everyday harms. And those everyday harms happened in families, within service relationships, and within all community spaces. And when a person with a learning disability is upset, they're often told to ignore those small or unimportant issues, but please take them seriously. And if your family member is someone you support cannot easily express their feelings, be observant to those everyday harms. Be their best communication assistant and challenge them. This is how to start a culture shift that costs nothing, but is deeply important to ensuring people with a learning disability live lives as free of abuse as possible. And I'll just hand over to you, Umi, to close us out.
Great, thanks, Brigit. So lastly, I wanted to talk about how we could use the Enabling Good Lives principle to guide us and stop us from experiencing the abuse and violence that people experienced in the past. So while in the formal sense, Enabling Good Life is under threat now, but these principles that's up on the screen should be able to still guide us and provide us a practical litmus test for and a way of challenging the factors that were identified as contributing to abuse and violence in disability and other care services in Royal Commission. When applied, all of these NGL principles should ensure that people with a learning disability have a life that is not characterized by a systemic abuse. Parents, carers, and close supporters, you may already be using these principles in the lives of the people you support. However, please continue to hold on to these principles and make sure that these are applied genuinely as part of your loved ones' lives. And support providers, please align your organization policies to EGL, provide training to operationalize the principle for your frontline staffs, and create a robust complaint system. Make sure that people know about it, believe reports of everyday harm, abuse, and respond to act. The final message we wanted to leave with you is that disability violence abuse is not caused by disabled people's inherent vulnerability. They, like everyone else, are made vulnerable by the individual, relational, community, and societal factors that's underpinned by colonization, ableism, and disableism that they are forced to navigate from birth. In some cases, even before they are born. We cannot achieve a cultural shift by perpetuating the notion that people are inherently and always vulnerable by legislating or regulating vulnerability. We will achieve it, however, by challenging our own internalized ableism and disableism, the ableism and disableism of others, and most importantly, by actively assisting children and adults with learning disability to have the tools they need to be their own best protectors. So this brings us to the end of our presentation, and to uplift us from this heavy topic, let's finish with Whakatoki chosen for the Project Tell Me About You report. He pōkeke uenuku I tūai. Against the dark cloud, the rainbow stands out brightly. The Whakatoki symbolizes the resilience and the resistance shown by the storytellers who generously shared their story with us so that others can learn from their story. So let's make sure that we do. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Brigit, Robbie, and Umi. Thank you for taking us through your research and the findings from the storytellers. Some profound learnings for us all there. Just a reminder that we will have a copy of this recording for people to view and listen to again. We have around 5 to 10 minutes for some questions. We've had a few questions come through. If we run a little over, is that okay for you, Brigit, Robbie, and Umi? Yeah, thank you. So the first question is, as a parent, I've heard the idea of right relationships between disabled people and paid support workers. Can you talk about that, what that is?
Would you like me to take that question, Robbie and Umi?
Yeah, you get us started and then I can perhaps finish off.
Absolutely. So if we think about the work that we have done with disabled people, particularly people with a learning disability, over many decades now, I think the right relationships are the types of relationships that are free from the kind of the factors that we've just gone through in this presentation there. So it is about relationships that can be that don't have those very overt power dynamics, relationships that are grounded on respect and trust, relationships that acknowledge people with the learning disabilities rights, but they're also their rights to have opinions and to respect those, and taking the time and the effort to learn about people so that you can assist with the expression of those opinions and those choices, those life choices. Maybe hand back to you, Robbie, in terms of
Yeah. The only thing I would add to that, and as someone who has support workers myself, this is that every relationship looks right differently to different people. And the important thing there is that it is the person with disability, and if they find it difficult to express themselves, it is through their their best communication assistant. It is that it is defined by the will and preference of that person and their family and whānau. So for me, you know, what I see as a right and good relationship with a support worker is different from what Umi wants from a support worker, because we lead quite different lives. From our person who is a research assistant with a learning disability at the DBI has a different perspective on what that is. So it's all about centering the preferences, the opinions, the will of the individual who is receiving that support and what they are looking for.
Great, thank you. That's a really helpful response. I'm going to hand over to Anita Nichols, who I mentioned earlier, to share the role of question answering. Anita, have you got another question there?
Yeah, this one comes from the chat, the question and answer. So Pip asked, has Whaikaha responded to these findings? And I guess I throw the question out to you guys because you'll know who best to answer the question.
Thanks for that, Anita. I saw that there in the Q&A. Thanks for the question. We haven't had a response to this research directly from Whaikaha, but what I will say is that this research is woven through the Royal Commission of Inquiry reports. So I think one of the things that we are really proud of with this work is that sometimes research doesn't make a difference, or it doesn't make a difference at the time that you hope it will. And in this case, the Royal Commission of Inquiry, sort of recognised the need for this, requested it, and have heavily utilised it. So the research findings were accepted as evidence of abuse and care for the group of people we worked with in the disability hearing. And also the findings and learnings from the research have been woven through those Royal Commission inquiry reports, and we think that honours the people who took part exceptionally well. And I just would note here that one of our storytellers I learned this morning has just passed away. So the importance of collecting the stories, particularly from older people that have experienced state care and abuse in those settings was critically important. We recognise that, some people wouldn't be here to see the outcomes of the Royal Commission, be able to apply for compensation if that's what happens, etc. And again, we've just experienced that this morning. So.
Thanks, Brigit.
Thanks.
Over to Andrea.
Thank you. We've just actually had a couple of comments too that I might read out because I'm not sure whether everyone can see those. So in regard to solutions, some disabilities such as FASD are not entitled to any funding or support under current criteria. A solution would be for government to include this cohort for funding. The abuse by the state is ongoing.
Yeah. Yeah, just acknowledge that comment. Absolutely correct. And I think, in our presentation, many of you out there will have definitely made the connection between the reasons that led people into state care being a lack of family support, a lack of funding, a lack of resourcing, and we need to be really mindful of what is occurring now, and we are deeply aware and acknowledge the restrictions and the lacks and the cuts, etc., that are impacting disabled people and their whānau right now.
Thanks, Brigit. This comment, another comment from a attendee as well, which I guess in some ways follows on, but I think is also important. So often family members are so traumatized by policy and abuse by the state, it is hard for them to advocate effectively for their loved ones. So again, a comment, but again, important.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, acknowledge and empathise. Again, it is family and whānau who are your loved one's best supporters, and it's a tiring task and a traumatic task, and we absolutely recognise that, but you do play this really critical role, and so hopefully we can support you in some way by highlighting that important and critical role that you play.
Thanks, Brigit. So another question here, sorry, Anita, shall I jump back to you? Did you want to keep going? I'm aware of time. So how was the 1950 to 1999 time frame decided on?
So that was the time frame, that was the terms of reference of the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse and Care. So that was decided on by the Royal Commission. Originally, it was going to be a longer time frame, coming to a bit more of the current. Still, I think it was 2006, wasn't it, guys? And so, but then that time frame was taken back. So we had to work within. With people who had experienced care in that period of time. The point that we want to make and want to continue to make is that that some of those things those factors that led to abuse in the past have that potential to be present in people's support arrangements and relationships and other things now. So hopefully that answers.
And in fact, we see it across all of our work at the Donald Beasley Institute. So this is just one of a wide range of research projects that we have been working on, that we are working on. And in every single one of our research projects, we see these same issues continually arising. So as researchers, we feel it is our responsibility to provide the data and evidence that repeatedly speaks to these ongoing issues. So while this project might have finished, we are still seeing the same things in our bias and policing work, and our monitoring of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and our work around access to services. So we are consistently highlighting it because it needs to be highlighted again and again and again. And we know change is possible. We have seen change happen incrementally, slowly over the years, but we have to keep pushing. We have to keep doing this, this mahi to ensure that we are working towards a better outcome for our disabled disability community and their whānau. So yeah, watch this space. Lots of stuff coming out at the moment around all of these issues that have been identified by the comments here.
Thanks, Robbie. I'll hand over to Anita for the last question. I can see people are dropping off. We've got time for one last question.
Yeah, so a question: what enables people with learning disability to speak up about issues that you know that they're worried by? I guess it's the fundamental underpinning of a lot of what you've talked about through the session.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of pieces to it, and I think given this webinar had its genesis and thinking about what was, you know, having the opportunity for family and whānau to be involved in thinking about this, that one of the critical things is that kind of starting early, and this is not just us saying this is the research in terms of creating your little amazing person as someone who recognises that they have rights and can express opinions and make decisions. And sometimes that's quite challenging as a parent. But what we know from the research is that if you're building the capacity in young disabled people's, you know, sense of self, but also that sense of, you know, making their own choices, then you are going to create that capacity in them to challenge and to question things that are happening to them. The people that we talked to in our research didn't have that kind of a experience in their young lives, and they didn't recognise that they had rights, and they didn't recognise that they could challenge things. And then, of course, they experienced all sorts of a system that even if they did get close to making a complaint, that it didn't respond to them. So that is one of the things. And I think the other is that that sometimes if I'm thinking about people who it might be really difficult to have a clear sort of understanding of what their will and their preference and their choices are, that again, families are really critical in that. And you know, we chose the language of being a communication assistant. A communication assistant is someone who helps the other person to understand what others are saying or communicating to them, and to communicate back out to those that are around them. And I think, you know, families are the person that knows, you know, your family member best. And supported decision making is something that we're really passionate about, even for people who others find it difficult to accept have capacity to make decisions. Again, that's you as families, as close supporters, as people who love that person that knows them best, however they express their choices, their likes and their dislikes, etc. But starting early is really critical. Thanks,
Brigit. Yes, communication assistant. That's a great term. I like that. It's a little bit more neutral, isn't it? But so important and critical. But we have had one last question, if you don't mind. If we ask that, are you okay if we do that, guys? Thank you. So how can we protect those who are not able to make their own informed choices when it comes to relationships with others, such as dating relationships, such as those who are not able to consent to sex under New Zealand law due to significant impairment?
So that is a massive question,
Yes.
and we probably don't have time to do it justice today. However, and there's a number of parts to it. We're actually, trying to make sense of that, unpack it in a way that's going to be useful for people going forward. And, a lot of that question relates to some changes in legislation, some reform of legislation, and, a real concern and desire to protect people. I think the short answer of the question today is that we really need to be very, very careful about how we position disabled people in our laws, and to not perpetuate that notion that people are inherently vulnerable, need to be protected from relationship, etc. I think there's other ways to answer that, or to address that concern. But yeah, so I think in the time we've got today, it's probably not a question we can answer quickly. But what I will say is that at the Donald Beasley Institute, we are trying to unpack that, the questions that sit around that, or the kind of context that sits around that question as quickly as we can. And we'll let you all know when we've got an answer that's accessible and kind of makes sense in that space. So again, a long-winded answer, but it is a really tricky question.
Oh, thank you, Brigit. That's tough, isn't it, to end on? On a fairly one, but I can sense another webinar coming out of it. So we'll get planning. But I think it's probably come to the time where I would like to again thank Brigit, Umi, and Robbie for your really considered and powerful presentations. There's a lot to think about and process. I'd like to thank the participants. I hope the information has been of value. I'd like to acknowledge and thank Leah at Te Pou, who has been setting up in the background and doing administrative support for the webinar. Just to remind everyone that there will be an email going out to all participants with a copy of the presentation and potentially a link to the recording, depending on how long that takes to happen. So that's all from me. And again, thank you to everyone. I'll hand over to the Donald Beasley Institute for our karakia to close.
Thank you. Been an awesome session today, and I encourage you to reach out to us at the DBI with further questions. And if you'd just like a yarn about any of these things, we're always open and available. Me karakia tātou. Kia ora te marino, kia whakapapa pounamu te moana. Hei huarahi, mā tātou I te rangi nei, aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou I e tātou katoa. Hui e tai ki e. May peace be widespread, may the sea be like greenstone, a pathway for us all this day. Let us show respect for each other, for one another, bind us all together.